Thank you for joining our session, World Compass for Commercializing, Manufacturing, and Marketing Cell and Gene Therapies, hosted by my law firm, Hogan Lovells. Pursuing cell and gene therapies aimed at outright curing rare and other crippling diseases that plague humanity has become a truly global enterprise. I want to acknowledge the important contributions that Bernie Siegel and the Regenerative Medicine Foundation have made in crafting a vision of global collaboration for creating regenerative medicines, and for many years of tireless work in building a platform to help advance that vision. I also want to thank them for providing this opportunity for me and my international Hogan Lovells colleagues to present today. We will discuss legal and regulatory frameworks around the world that we all will have to navigate successfully for cell and gene therapies to realize their true potential. I am very pleased that joining me today are my colleagues Natalia Gulyaeva and Julia Guriyeva from the Moscow office of Hogan Lovells, Arne Thiermann from our Hamburg office, and Mandi Jacobson from our Sydney office. So Natalia is the managing partner for our Moscow office. She heads the firm's global regulatory and intellectual property, media, and technology practice groups, and the life sciences and healthcare industry group for Russia and for the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. She's quite a busy person. Her diverse practice encompasses dispute resolution, arbitration and litigation, transactional work, and regulatory advice to the life sciences industry. Julia is this senior associate of our Moscow office. She focuses on regulatory and intellectual property issues in the fields of life sciences and technology. Julia is a qualified Russian advocate authorized to represent clients in all Russian courts. Arne is a life sciences partner in our German Strategic Operations, Agreements, and Regulations team, or SOAR. He helps clients on all contractual and regulatory aspects to set up cross-border supply chains for innovative cell tissue and gene therapy products and to market such products in Europe. And last but definitely not least is Mandi Jacobson. She's a partner in our Sydney, Australia office. Mandi focuses on regulatory and product liability issues in the fields of life sciences and technology. Her diverse practice encompasses dispute resolution, transactional work, data protection, and regulatory advice in the life sciences industry. I will be moderating the session. I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Hogan Lovells. I'm in our pharmaceutical and biotechnology practice area. And I also chair our firm's global cell tissue and gene therapy working group, which encompasses regenerative medicine and advanced therapy medicinal products all over the world, with membership of over 140 personnel from Hogan Lovells around the world. So we'll start it off with a discussion of the overall legal and regulatory frameworks that govern these innovative products. So we'll start with Europe. So Arne, if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about the general framework for authorizing innovative gene and cell therapies in the EU market, that would be great.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. And thank you for this opportunity to talk at this World Stem Cell Summit. So very much appreciated. To begin with, on the European side, the products, they are really innovative, but the framework that's governing them, it's not that new, actually. So there is a framework for advanced therapy medicinal products already more than 10 years in the European Union, which allows for a centralized marketing authorization process. The term ATMP, so advanced therapy medicinal products, covers a whole range of different innovative products. So there are three main types: gene therapy products or medicines, somatic cell therapy medicines, and tissue engineered medicines, which are all governed by this specific procedure. There are currently actually also a number of unregulated cell-based therapies out there in the EU. And the EMA has just recently warned last year against unproven cell therapies as cures for a broad range of conditions, including cancer, cardiovascular diseases, autism, muscular dystrophy, or vision loss. Why is there unregulated therapies like that in the market? It has to do with that, yeah, there are a couple of research institutes and organizations working on cell therapies, stem cell therapies, tissue engineering for a couple of years on their own. And within their organization, these are usually also high-ranked medical practitioners, and they are already applying therapies, but these do not necessarily already fall then under or have been authorized yet. And so what we see now at the moment is that there is an initiative also on the European level to make patients aware of the risk of unregulated cell therapies. So one of the first questions indicated to patients is actually ask your doctor whether the cell therapy that he wants to apply with you has been authorized and has been subject of the central authorization procedure. So there is a clear will and intention on the European side to have these cell therapies regulated under the ATMP regime to ensure quality and patient safety. And there is actually also a couple of incentives for companies that want to go this route, and that in the end, if they do it on a commercial basis and not, based on a sole medical practitioners initiative, they have to undergo this procedure. But there are a couple of incentives to obtain material reductions in the fees for scientific advice. If it's a small, medium entity, it's like almost like 90% reduction of the fees, but also fees reduction in the certification procedure. So on the one hand, you see that the EMA clearly wants to put some pressure on these unregulated cell therapies in order to be regulated under the ATMP procedure, but there are also a couple of attractive incentives to go with this route. Mike, I think you're still on mute.
Thank you, Arne. And we'll talk more about the incentives later in our hour. I would just add that there's a parallel situation happening in the United States that actually just on May 31st was the end of a period where FDA granted sort of a safe harbor or enforcement discretion period for many of these therapies, and is now similarly trying to pressure and encourage companies to go the more formal approved route in the United States. So it's interesting that there is a parallel situation going on both in Europe and in the US about that, where there's definitely pressures and incentives to be more regulated and bring these products under more control. So now we'll turn to Russia, and I'll turn to Julia and ask if you could tell us a little bit about the general framework for authorization of cell and gene therapies in your country.
Perhaps, Mike, before Julia covers the Russian regulations, we would like to add that our practice in Russia and CIS focuses not only on Russian law, but on the legislation of the Eurasian Economic Union. You have kindly mentioned in the beginning Commonwealth of Independent States, which is also the territory where we operate. Geographically, this is a territory of the former Soviet Union. And it's true that all the laws in the territory, they are to a wide extent unified, and you can see the same approaches and the same regulations in all the countries of the CIS. Even closer, the law systems are in the Eurasian Economic Area, which has been established several years ago, and currently it's Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Belarus are the countries which are within the Union, and have similar regulations also in the area of pharma, medical devices, and of course CTGT is an important area where the regulations are being developed. And finally, in the Eurasian Economic Union, like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, we have recognitions for our work, like in Russia, but also outside of Eurasian Economic Area, like in Uzbekistan, we also have a very deep expertise in the area. But for all the countries, in the majority of cases, the Russian law approaches will be correct, and Julia is going to address them now.
Thank you. So, unlike the Europe, Russian regulation of cell therapies and gene therapies is in process of development, and the law, particularly regulating the biomedical products, which are cell products and gene therapy products, is dated 2019, the recent amendment. So it's quite new, and its application is still in course of development. The enforcement practices is developing these days. And we also have a number of draft laws in this sphere. So it's subject to further development also. Basically, Russian law recognizes ex vivo and in vivo products. And in vivo products will likely fall under medical products, which are subject to market authorization like other medicines. While ex vivo products are recognized, as I said, as biomedical products, they are subject to separate kind of marketing authorization, which includes clinical trials and ethics approvals and so on and so forth. The registration process is a bit different comparing to medical products registration, and lasts a bit longer in according to the regulation, obviously. So in practice, both processes may be quite, may take quite long. It's notable to say that Russian law addresses some basic principles in the sphere, like donors may not be paid for donating their cells, and cell and gene materials may not be sold on the market. So it's restricted unless the product becomes the registered one, obviously. So there is particular protections provided to any gene therapies related to human embryos. So Russian law particularly says that it's prohibited to use human embryos for the studies if the embryos are particularly developed for that studies. So it's prohibited. And abortion for these purposes is also prohibited. This is overall the general regulation in Russia.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalia and Julia. Now we'll turn to Australia. So Mandi, if you could tell us a little bit about the general legal framework for authorizing cell and gene therapies in Australia, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Mike. A big good day from Australia. It's a great honor to obviously be presenting with the Hogan Lovells team at this really great conference. So thank you, Mike and team, for the invitation. In Australia, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is our regulator, which we call the TGA, is responsible for the regulation of products for therapeutic use, including human cells and tissues, which we coined biologicals. This includes human stem cell treatments. Presently in Australia, the only established stem cell treatment that is actually approved is hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, which we call HPC transplantation. That's when you use stem cells from umbilical cord blood or bone marrow, which, as you guys would appreciate, is quite standard practice for the treatment of quite a few disorders of the blood and immune system, such as leukemia. The use of fresh bone marrow derived HPC is standard practice, and it is exempt from oversight by our regulator. Cord blood derived from HPC is usually stored frozen prior to use. So it does involve some level of processing, and as such is approved by our regulator. Besides that though, and currently, there are no other stem cell treatments that have been demonstrated by our regulator to be safe and effective.
Great, very interesting. So let's drill down a little bit more on some of those particular regulations and any of the details within your countries. Let's continue with you, Mandi. And if you talk about, understand there's some fairly recent regulation by the TGA. So why don't you fill us in a little bit more on that and some of the details?
Yeah, sure, Mike, thank you. It's definitely an area of law where our regulator is continuing to become more and more involved. And is trying to strengthen the regulation of stem cell treatments in Australia, which, as everybody would understand, is to be expected. In about July 2009, our TGA did actually introduce some new regulation. And under these new regulations, all providers of cell and tissue products who operate outside of hospitals will need to meet the TGA's requirement for safety, quality, and effectiveness. Some stem cell products that would otherwise be considered biologicals have actually now been excluded from our regulator's regulation or oversight. And this was done through a determination called the Therapeutic Goods Excluded Goods Determination of 2018, but only on the proviso that they meet three criteria, being they must be collected from a patient who is under the clinical care of a medical or dental practitioner that is registered under a law of a state or a territory in Australia. Secondly, that it's manufactured by that medical or dental practitioner or by a person under the professional supervision of that medical or dental practitioner in a hospital, excepting for storage and testing for that particular patient of that hospital. And lastly, it must not be advertised to consumers. So, Mike, a lot of regulation, which we will expect, we will continue to see further updates to our law.
Very interesting. And parallel, US has gone through some parallel situations with various exclusions and then a tightening, as I mentioned before, with the recognition that a lot of people sort of took unfair advantage in the United States of the exclusions, which means that there are a lot of companies out there who now in the United States are going to have to come to grips with a much more strict regime, and in some cases, such as amniotic fluid, the inability to sell at all until there's an approval in the US. So I definitely encourage companies to consider foreign markets. And obviously there are regulations that we can help interpret, but there may be opportunities also to consider. So thank you, Mandi. So let's turn back to Russia and hear a little bit more of the specifics of the laws and regulations governing these cellular therapies there.
Absolutely, and with great pleasure. And here, of course, with CTGT therapies being on the top of minds of big companies and, of course, the patients, we have to think about opportunities which the companies working on and developing CTGT therapies, how to protect their rights. And here, one important thing which needs to be considered for Russia and Eurasian Economic Area is that that patenting of CTGT therapies is limited in the territory due to the exemption, which is a part of the patent law system in the countries, basically prohibiting patenting human embryo gene modifications. The exemptions are very clear, and they are a part of the Russian Civil Code covering all the intellectual property issues. And precisely it says that it cannot, that the objects of patent rights, including methods of cloning a person and his clone, methods for modifying the genetic integrity of human cells, the use of human embryos for industrial and commercial purposes, plus the results of intellectual activity relating to all aforementioned, if they contradict public interests, cannot be patented. This exemption for many years remained simply a part of the law, and there was absolutely no court practice because CTGT was not at the stage where it is now. But very recently, we had the case before the Russian Court for Intellectual Property Rights. It's happened in 2020 during the COVID times. And in this case, the Russian Intellectual Property Court was considering whether the refusal of the Russian PTO in patenting the solution, which was according to opinion of the Russian PTO examiner covered by the exemption, whether this refusal was legal or illegal. To give you a flavor of what was the issue in this case, the set of features of the claimed invention was literally a method for editing the human CCR5 gene for the purpose of introducing a delta 32 deletion at an early stage of human embryo development using the CRISPR-Cas9 system, using a mixture of guide RNAs with the sequence, etc. And the Russian Intellectual Property Court considered that this set of features of the claimed invention is within the exemption provided by the law, and therefore the decision of Rospatent refusing issue of patent was based on the law. It was the decision which remained in force. It does, of course, say that in future, the Russian Patent Office approach in to patenting similar methods will be the same. But of course, each case is individual, and if you consider patenting of a particular element of CTGT therapy, if it sounds appropriate for you, then each case may have other chances of success and needs to be carefully reviewed. But it's important to keep it in mind before filing patent applications for seeking protection in the region. Mike?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Really interesting developments. So I'd like to turn it back to Arne and hear a little bit about the specifics of cellular regulation in Germany, including anything about embryonic stem cells and the collection of tissues there.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mike. I mean, we're touching a couple of different aspects here, but it also shows, yeah, how complex and fascinating not only the product but also the legal landscape for these products is. When you look at the collection and processing of tissue to start with, human tissue, we also step into a field which is not surprisingly regulated. So in Europe, there's generally, let's say, two sets of regulation that you can find. So a product-related authorization, which generally allows for, if granted, the marketing of a specific product. So that this is the kind of authorization that we talked about in the beginning, the ATMP, the central procedure, which in general allows a certain stem cell therapy, cell-based therapy, to be marketed in the whole European Union. On the other hand, you have in Europe a full set of regulation, let's say, on the activity related level. So, for instance, if you manufacture, collect a certain tissue, then you also subject to regulation, which is to a certain extent still product related, but in the end, activity related, and looking at the specific activity that is performed and by whom. So what we here have to conclude is that the landscape is less harmonized and centralized. There are some European directives which provide a certain framework, for instance, for the collection of human tissue. But these need to be implemented into national law. And as often happens in Europe, there is some room how you implement a directive into national law. And this is then by a couple of member states also being applied and used. So if you look at the tissue related legislation in European countries, you will see quite a lot of differences. For instance, in Germany, they even managed to implement the directive in a way which is not fully consistent with the directive. So that this will be amended in the near future. But at the moment, there are some specificities with respect to Germany. So which means in the end you have a centrally authorized product, but when looking at the different activities, so when you collect autologous material in a certain facility, send it to another facility for further processing and manufacture, and you look at the licenses and authorizations that these facilities need to have, you leave the European level and come in Germany even to a local level, and looking at licenses which need to be granted by the local competent authorities under national law. And there are some specificities to be observed, and also depending on the type of tissue you're looking at. So for instance, if you're looking at an ATMP product, this is clearly a medicinal product. You will need to follow GMP principles. A site that is manufacturing those products needs to have a manufacturing license, GMP certificate, and the like. But for instance, if you look at other tissue products, it may still be considered a medicinal product, but not reach the level of an ATMP. but still in Germany regulated, for instance, under Medicinal Products Act, but with some lowered, let's say, requirements. So if your product is then, and that's a term used in Germany, is not industrially or processed in an industrial level, whatever this means, you may have some exemptions to apply GMP, and you may only be subject to some form of good practice, which is also some setting a standard, but not as high as GMP standards. You would not need to obtain a manufacturing license, but it would just be a registration with the federal authority. So really depending on the tissue that one is working on, looking at, there may be different sets of activity-related registrations and licenses for that, and it really depends from product to product in what category you fall and what requirements you have to adhere. And this will usually also require that you take a closer look at the product, which is in hand. I mean, for products like being regulated as ATMP, it's clearer, but if you have a product which does not operate on that level, but is, let's say, less advanced, there can be quite a difference when it comes to the applicable rules and therefore also the registration and licenses to that.
Thank you, Arne. Really, really interesting. And it raised some challenges. So I'd like to turn to the issue of supply chain and import and export. Given all these myriads of different requirements, I'd like each of you to talk about what some of the requirements are for bringing materials in and out of the countries and some of the approaches that we use to help companies navigate those. So let's turn to Russia, and I'll ask about the import and export of biomaterials, how they're subject to licensing in the Eurasian Economic Union, including Russia, and how the different products, how that regulation impacts different products.
Thank you, Meg. There is unified regulation related to export and import in the Eurasian Union. So most of the cell and gene products would fall under authorization required by the local authorized state body. In Russia, it would be Roszdravnadzor. While tissues, organs, blood would fall under a requirement to get license from the Ministry of Trade and Manufacturing. Also, the samples of biomaterials, like for testing and so on and so forth, they would fall under authorization requirement as well, both import and export.
Great. Thank you. Let's turn back then, given those variations, let's go just across to back to you, Arne. And if you could talk a little bit about the import and export of human tissue, blood, and biomaterials in the European countries and what the implications are for that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I'm afraid we're really getting more and more to a level which is scattered and subject to national law. So we started with a good message saying there's a European regime for the ATMP, and then I talked a lot about, implementing European directives into national law, which still provide for some harmonization on the European level. But I'm afraid when it comes to research and importing, exporting of human tissue, blood, and other samples, it gets sometimes really national and different from country to country. We also see overlapping balancing between data protection and some regulatory requirements that you will see when you handle tissue and human samples in general. For instance, we had an interesting research project for a client to look at, where just simply 2 countries were involved, using some human tissue from France for research in Germany, and this already created a couple of questions. So under what requirements you can collect the tissue, what you have to obtain from the patients. Is it a certain informed consent form? What are there any rules for these informed consent? And there are national differences. In France, you might have something like a non-objection form, whereas in Germany you would require a more elaborate informed consent form, which really outlines to the patient what the subject matter of the research would be and what the purposes would be. And this all raises then the interesting question, which is also usually subject of a lot of discussion in the data protection, of the secondary uses. So having, for instance, data of tissue and samples being taken for a certain medical clinical study, it may come up that later on these samples become interesting for other purposes. And then we have seen cases actually within a due diligence where it turned out that the target company used certain human antibodies for totally different purposes than they were collected, and based the whole product development on that. And so the problem occurred, what happens to the product development? Was it still contained by the informed consent or other regulation? And was it actually possible what they did? And this is a setting which we think is not seldom. First, that tissues and samples are being taken out of one country into another, and then maybe later used for other purposes than initially thought. Because I mean, that's just how research usually goes, that you get a different or new idea, and then you think, oh, I might re-examine certain samples that I have in stock, but they may not have been collected for these specific purposes.
And we've seen very similar things in the US. We have a whole privacy team that deals with informed consents and those kinds of issues, and coordinates with our colleagues around the world to make sure that all the different requirements are anticipated, so that you have the maximum opportunity to use your materials the way that the science evolves. So let's turn to Australia. Mandi, please tell us anything you can about the significance of and challenges of importing, exporting in Australia and supply chain issues there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. The import and export of embryonic stem cell lines that are derived from human embryo clones is regulated by 2 different pieces of law we have, but they both the customs and prohibited import regulations. One's 1956 and the second one's in 1958. And essentially, people wishing to import or export such cell lines need to apply to our minister, being the minister who administers the prohibition of human cloning for reproduction. And that in itself is fits within some separate legislation that we have as well. But you actually need to apply to that minister for written permission. If you are importing or exporting, so import or export will only be allowed if the cell lines have been derived using practices that are consistent with all of the different Australian pieces of legislation and regulation. And importantly, our National Health and Medical Research Council has the responsibility for administering a permit scheme in Australia. If you wish to import or export embryonic stem cell lines derived from human embryo clones, then you need to actually get in contact with the National Health and Medical Research Council and apply for one of these permits. And lastly, if you are importing or exporting embryonic stem cell lines that have not actually been derived from human clones, that's actually regulated through another government channel in Australia, being our Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. So in a nutshell, it's quite a complex system with a lot of permits and licenses that need to be acquired.
Thank you, Mandi. Definitely something that we can assist and commonly do. So let's turn to, for companies that are thinking globally, like we all increasingly will need to do, let's talk a little bit about the incentives that the various countries provide and opportunities, but also limitations and things to watch out for. So let's turn back to Russia and hear about funding opportunities there, which I understand there are some new ones, and other opportunities and things to consider.
Absolutely. I think we have already spoken on limitations, and therefore now I would opt to speak about opportunities. And indeed, there are great developments for orphan medicines, not just early market access, but also simplified registration procedure for such medicines. But it's not all. In the past, we had some private initiatives for purchase of drugs for orphan diseases, which have not been registered in Russia yet. But now this has been brought to the level of the state, and in 2021, despite all the difficulties of the pandemic, which all we are facing, the fund has been created. The name of the fund is Circle of Kindness, and it has been created by the state. The founder is the Ministry of Health of Russia. And in January 2021, our President Putin has signed the decree on creation of the fund. You will ask how actually it is supposed to function, because from where the funds would come. And the simple answer is that we had recently an increase of the income tax rate for wealthy citizens. And precisely this increased personal income tax for wealthy citizens is becoming the source of funds which will be used for purchase of medicines by the fund. Here, currently, we have in the list 10 diseases which have been approved by the fund for purchase of medicines. Particularly, there are also there are currently 8 APIs which are approved for purchase, and the first drug approved by the foundation is Spinraza by Biogen. We do expect that this fund will become a great source of support for the patients with orphan diseases, and also for me as a Russian citizen, it's nice to see that there has been this initiative despite all the difficulties, and I really hope that it will be a success, which also gives a chance to the producers of drugs for orphan diseases to commercialize their products in Russia, because that's an important mission. We all understand and appreciate this.
Excellent. Let's turn back to Australia now. And Mandi, if you could tell us some of the considerations that innovators in this space should take into account.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. As you will appreciate, there's a lot of sensitivity due to the vulnerability of this patient group. And our regulator in Australia, he never shies away from putting as many criminal offence and civil offence provisions into our legislation. So that would, of course, apply. So there are criminal offences and civil penalties under our Therapeutic Goods Act, in particular where a person promotes or advertises the use of human cells and tissue products to the public. So it's prohibited. Human cell and tissue products that are actually regulated as biologicals are prohibited from being advertised to the public. And this also would include human cell and tissue products that have even been exempt or excluded from being included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. So in a nutshell, advertising and promotion is not permitted, and offence provisions apply.
Important to know, things we can help companies make sure they're careful about. And finally, we'll turn to you, Arne, and if you could tell us a little bit about the opportunities and considerations in Europe.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We mentioned in the beginning that there are some incentives on the EMA level, which applies to scientific advice. So there is a general a reduction in fees with respect to the scientific advice of ATMPs as compared to, let's say, regular procedures for medicinal product authorization. And then there was an additional set of reduction for small, medium entities, which I think can end up in like 90% reduction of the fees of for the scientific advice. There's also the possibility to combine the ATMP procedure with an orphan drug designation, which can often be a route, given that usually very tailored and personalized medicinal treatments. That the orphan drug procedure also brings certain incentives and benefits. Most of all, the market exclusivity in Europe for 10 years, which provides for patent-like exclusivity from a regulatory side. So it's not IP protection, but it gives you really an exclusive market position for 10 years. So the orphan drug designation is certainly very attractive for products. And what we also see, and this is probably in line with other markets, that these products are very, very cost intensive and expensive. On that level, maybe we have to conclude that things or there are some developments on the national state level to cut costs or control costs with respect to these treatments, where it's like a couple of $100,000 or million just per one treatment, and that we will see reimbursement structures where there is payment on a success basis. So only if a certain treatment really is successful with a certain patient, that there will be full payment by social security funds. And this may be seen as incentive or the opposite, but this is certainly a development which becomes a reality in more and more European markets, that we will see this on a reimbursement side level.
Excellent. And in the United States, we have similar issues where these therapies that promise, and some of them have now been proven to be a one-shot cure for life of a disease, are very expensive. They're expensive to develop, and the price is very high. And so we have a whole team in the United States which has been on the leading edge of some of those issues. Well, this has been very enlightening. Let me just open the floor if anyone has any final thoughts or comments for people to consider when trying to bring regenerative medicine to the world? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Well, I can add on the restrictions also. We just said that we have a new market for the orphan disease treatments. But here again, we have some old restrictions related to promoting the treatments related to transplantation of organs and tissues. It's Russian advertising law addressing since, I think, more than 10 years. Maybe it somehow will be amended, but this is the kind of, we have some incentives and old restrictions applicable here. But the restrictions don't clearly apply to the gene therapies. So when we talk about stem cells, then somehow it could be applied because stem cells is a part of the human, obviously, and that could be interpreted in the way that the restriction is applied. Yeah, but this is about Russian restrictions there.
But basically this confirms the complexity of the regulatory and other issues in the area. And I hope that for those who have a chance to see this webinar, it will be clear that we are a nice team across the continents, and we know the stuff. We are happy to give a hand where we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, and hopefully nice and capable. We are all, and most capable of all of us, I think, is certainly Mike. When you have asked us a lot in these last minutes, what's your take on, what do you see on the horizon and as trend in this area in the coming years? What do we see here coming from that space?
Well, I mean, as you can tell from my tone, I'm really, really excited and encouraged by all the developments. In the United States, I just heard from some of the United States, there are over 1,000 pending applications to test gene therapies in humans. It's called an investigation new drug application, which means that's just an explosion of innovation that in the coming years is going to be addressing some of the most profound health problems that we face, and all of us face it, including Alzheimer's and all kinds of autoimmune diseases, cancers. And I just think that the possibilities and opportunities here are really profound, but some care has to be taken to make sure that we go in the right direction. In the United States, sadly, in the end of the 80s, there was an incident that shut down gene therapy for about almost 10 years. And fortunately, the dedicated scientists that were working on it didn't give up and kept plugging away till now we have the dawn of this new age. But I'm really encouraged, but also have a bit of seasoned caution that we all have to be very mindful of the precautions we should take as we strive forward with this new promise. So if there are any final words? Okay, so thank you again for listening to our presentation. I hope it was educational and enlightening. And we look forward to interacting with you at the World Stem Cell Summit and beyond. So please reach out to all of us, and thank you for the work that you are doing to bring these therapies to patients. Take care.